This is a very unique place, and it's all revolves around the Dead Sea. If the Dead Sea disappears, the tourism industry will also disappear, as well as local livelihoods. There's local agriculture here, right? If the Dead Sea goes, those communities are also going to be at risk. So saving the Dead Sea is an environmental issue, but it's not just an environmental issue. It's an economic one. It's about development. It's about communities. It's about saving this very unique place. And we have a real dilemma, because on the one hand, we say, let's save the Dead Sea. On the other hand, we need the water. We don't have enough water. So the question is, what do we do? There's only one solution to save the Dead Sea, and that is to bring water back to make up the difference from what we took. If we can't bring water back to the Dead Sea, then the sea will continue to decline 1 meter every year. It will never disappear, but eventually it will be a very, very, very small, very salty, small little puddle that will have no use to anybody. As the shoreline has been receding, it's creating these sinkholes, as you see in front of you. And the sinkholes are a direct consequence of the receding water levels. I'll explain to you. Let's go have a look at them. Sinkholes began to be discovered towards the end of the 1970s, and people didn't really understand what was happening. Then they started to do research on the issue, and it's now clear that what we're seeing here, the collapse, the literal collapsing of the ground, is a direct consequence of the water levels receding. Today we know that what you see here is just one example of over 10,000 sinkholes all along the shoreline, on the western side of the Dead Sea and on the eastern side in Jordan as well. This means that the entire area is becoming very, very unstable and very unsafe. It's a very serious issue because these sinkholes are threatening all the infrastructure in the region. Roads, bridges, power lines, water and sewage, agricultural land, and tourism facilities like beaches. So if we are to have any long-term presence here, it's a question of sustainability, really. The most pressing issue is to help and manage and control this issue of sinkholes, because sinkholes will continue to form so long as the water level continues to recede. Under our feet is groundwater, fresh water, that originates in the Jerusalem mountains. Normally, most of that water infiltrates as groundwater and then flows towards the Dead Sea. Now, what's stopping that groundwater flow is the Dead Sea itself. When the groundwater flows, right, it eventually reaches the seawater. I'm talking underground, not above surface, right? Now, because you have two different concentrations, fresh water and highly dense saline water, what do you think is going to happen when the two waters meet? The fresh water flow is going to stop, right, as it meets the seawater because of the difference in solutes. So what we have is what we call a freshwater saltwater interface. So the groundwater can only move as far as the seawater. But what is now happening is that the rate of seawater decline is so rapid, right, 1 meter every year, is that seawater is receding like this. And as it recedes, it is exposing under the ground blocks of salt, very large blocks of salt under the ground. Right, now what's happening is as the seawater recedes, those salt blocks are being exposed, and then what happens? The groundwater follows the seawater. But now, instead of meeting the seawater, it first meets those salt blocks. What's going to happen? The solution, right? The fresh water dissolves, mixes with the salt, and we get underground caverns. Now, this is a process that is dynamic. It keeps happening. You can't stop it. So the more groundwater flows, the larger those cavities under our feet happen, till eventually they're so large that the above ground soil layer that we're standing on collapses inwards. And the result, sinkholes. So what we have here is a very dynamic process between fresh groundwater and seawater and salt. All right, the interaction of fresh water, seawater and salt gives us the sinkholes. Now, how do we resolve this issue? You have to stabilize the water level. Yeah. If the seawater stops moving, the groundwater will stop. And at that point, you won't have the continued dissolution of salt. Now, how do you stop the seawater receding? You've got to stabilize the water levels. How do you stabilize the water levels? Bring water back to the Dead Sea to balance out the water that is evaporating. This is why everybody is concerned now about stabilizing the Dead Sea. Because if we don't stabilize the Dead Sea water levels, this phenomenon of sinkholes is just going to get worse. And it's going to spread. Right? Because there's nothing one can do technically, financially, to stop groundwater flow. So now the challenge is to stabilize the Dead Sea water means putting back into the system about 800 million cubic meters of water per year. Because that is only that amount will balance the evaporation.